A brutal winter storm ripped through a quiet town in Duluth, and beneath a fallen tree, a secret buried for 60 years began to breathe again. Michael, a retired Marine seeking silence, followed his German shepherd Duke into the frozen earth, never imagining what waited below. As enemies return and the truth claws its way to the surface, one old soldier and one loyal dog stand between justice and greed. This is not just a mystery. This is a reckoning. What happens next will shake your faith and rebuild it. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if you believe truth never stays buried, subscribe now. Winter came down on Duluth like a slow, merciless breath of ice, pressing against roofs, streets, and bone alike, beneath a sky the color of old steel. Michael Harris lived on the northern edge of the city, where the houses thinned and the forest began to reclaim what humans once borrowed. At 65, he still carried the frame of a man who had once moved through danger, as if danger were a language he spoke fluently. His shoulders were broad and heavy, his arms thick with old strength, hardened by decades of military service and manual labor. Deep scars mapped his hands where gunmetal once burned against skin, and every knuckle carried the permanent stiff swelling of impact and recoil. His beard, once jet black, now lay silver-streaked against a square, angular jaw that had never fully learned how to rest. His eyes were a faded blue, steady but burdened, carrying the quiet weight of memories that refused to release him even in retirement. The small wooden house behind him had belonged to his father, and before that, his grandfather. It leaned slightly against the wind, as if bowing to a threat it had learned never to fight. Michael had returned here after the Marines finally released him from their long grip, not because he wanted peace, but because he no longer knew where else to stand. The only living thing that seemed to understand that silence was Duke. Duke was a German shepherd of mixed silver gray and black, his coat thick and layered for cold climates, his posture disciplined without training, as though instinct itself had shaped him. At 6 years old, he bore no scars from battle, but his eyes carried the quiet watchfulness of a creature that had learned fear before trust. Michael had pulled him from a rescue shelter 2 years earlier after seeing that look, the same look he saw in his own reflection in dark glass. Since then, Duke rarely left his shadow. He slept when Michael slept, watched when Michael watched, and rose instantly when Michael's body stiffened without warning. That night, the storm arrived without ceremony. Wind tore across the roof in violent pulses, shaking window frames as snow slammed sideways against the glass. The house groaned in protest, as if remembering storms long buried in timber grain. In the first thunderclap, Michael's breath locked in his chest, not from cold, but from the echo of explosions memory never quite forgets. Duke moved instantly from the rug to his side and pressed his large head against Michael's thigh with quiet insistence. Michael laid a trembling hand into the warmth of that fur and forced air back into his lungs. Outside, the storm raged through the darkness, tearing into the land like a living thing. By morning, the world lay broken and silent beneath fresh white ruin. Michael stepped outside wrapped in his thick coat, boots crunching against ice. Snow-laden air burned his lungs with each breath. Branches lay scattered across the yard like snapped ribs. Then his gaze found the empty space where the old maple had stood since long before he learned to walk. The tree was gone, its great roots torn from the earth and flung aside like a body after impact, leaving behind a raw wound in the ground. For a long moment, Michael simply stood there staring as if he had lost another witness to his life without ceremony. Behind him, Duke moved. Instead of circling the fallen trunk or nosing through scattered limbs, the dog ran straight to the open pit where the roots had been torn free. His tail stiffened. He lowered his head and sniffed once, then again, deeper and slower. A sound rose from his chest that Michael had heard only once before in the shelter, that low, uncertain whine that meant something was wrong. Then Duke began to bark, sharp and urgent, digging at the half-frozen soil with powerful front paws. Michael called his name once. Duke did not turn. Snow and dirt sprayed outward with each violent stroke. Michael reached the edge and peered down through the churned ice. At first he saw nothing but broken roots and dark earth. Then his eyes caught a rectangular edge buried at an angle beneath the soil. Metal, rusted brown and flat. And in the center of it, faint beneath years of corrosion, a thick valve handle, a hatch. Michael's breath left him slowly. His first thought was simple and careless. Some old storage cellar, buried before his father was born. The property was old. The land kept secrets the way forests always do. He climbed down cautiously, Duke stepping back to give him room, still panting with excitement. With gloved hands, Michael brushed away layers of packed ice and soil. The rectangular shape grew larger. The handle revealed itself fully, heavy and stubborn, bolted into steel that had once been purpose-built and then left behind by the world. He stood there looking at it as the wind whispered through broken branches above. Michael had spent most of his life opening doors other men were afraid to approach. He had kicked his share of them down under gunfire and smoke. But this door rested silently beneath his feet, with no enemy behind it. Only time. And somehow that made it heavier. Duke stood beside him, muscles tight, ears upright, eyes fixed on the metal, as if listening to something still breathing on the other side. Michael told himself he would come back with tools later. The cold was biting too deep, and the storm had left enough repair work for any one man. Still, as he climbed back out of the pit, he felt the quiet wrongness of it settle beneath his ribs. The storm had not only taken a tree, it had uncovered something that had not expected light again. He looked once more at the hatch before turning away. Inside the house, he hung his coat beside the door and moved slowly through rooms that smelled of old wood and cold iron. Duke followed at heel without command, his presence steady and silent. Michael poured black coffee into a chipped mug and stared through the window at the yard where White had reclaimed the wound in the earth. For the first time in years, he felt the old unease rise in him without a battlefield to explain it. Whatever waited beneath that fallen tree had been hidden on purpose, and Winter, indifferent to intention, had decided it was time. Michael returned to the frozen pit at first light, when the sky over Duluth was still pale and hard as frost-bitten steel. Duke moved ahead of him, alert but restrained now, the urgency from the previous day replaced by a focused unease that mirrored his master's own. Michael brought the tools with him this time: a pry bar, a heavy claw hammer, a thermos of boiling water, and the slow patience of a man who had learned that force alone often ruined what precision could save. He poured steaming water over the corroded valve handle until ice hissed and cracked, then wedged the pry bar into its spokes and leaned in with the quiet discipline of a Marine who had once opened steel under far worse conditions. The handle groaned, resisted, then shifted with a grinding cry that seemed to rise from inside the earth itself. When the slab finally lifted, a breath of damp, cold air rushed upward, carrying with it the smell of old cement, rust, and a faint sweetness of decay that had waited decades for motion. Michael told Duke to stay, his voice low and firm, the same tone he had once used in combat to keep men alive. Duke hesitated only a breath before sitting at the edge, muscles tight, eyes locked on the opening. Michael descended one careful step at a time, his boots scraping frost from concrete stairs that vanished downward into shadow. At the bottom, his flashlight revealed a narrow, rectangular room of bare walls and exposed ceiling ribs, a shelter built not for comfort, but endurance. Against the far wall stood a simple wooden table with one uneven leg propped by a wedge of scrap. A gray steel shelving unit sagged under the weight of nothing but dust. In the corner sat an old military radio with a cracked face panel, its dials frozen in time. Beneath the table rested a green ammunition crate, its paint blistered and peeling, its latches intact but stiff with corrosion. The air was stale but not sealed. A thin vertical crack had formed along one wall, enough to let moisture breathe slowly across the years. Michael recognized that detail instantly as the kind of flaw that allowed decay to happen quietly without collapsing a structure. He knelt and forced the crate open with the hammer's pry edge. Inside lay no weapons, no gold, no documents in bulk. Only one object rested in the center, wrapped in yellowed oilcloth: a journal. The leather was worn smooth by handling, darkened by the oils of long dead fingers. The embossing on the inside cover read a name Michael had not spoken aloud in years. Thomas Harris, his father. The man who had raised him with discipline but little tenderness, who had taught him how to balance a rifle before he taught him how to speak fear. Michael's grip tightened until the leather creaked. He carried the journal upstairs with care he had rarely afforded anything except injured men. That night, by the dim glow of a single lamp, Michael opened the book at his kitchen table while Duke lay at his feet, chin resting on crossed paws, eyes never leaving his face. The first pages were ordinary, almost gentle. Weather logs, snow accumulation, fence repairs, coffee tastes bitter in January. The language was spare and practical, the voice of a man who built his life from wood and routine. But with each passing entry, something shifted. The dates grew irregular. The margins filled with signs of hesitation. The simple farmer's voice hardened into a cadence of unease. There were references to money without amounts, to meetings without locations. A man identified only as Watson appeared again and again, described as precise, educated, mechanically minded. Another figure surfaced more darkly as Cole, impatient, volatile, hungry. The three men spoke of an investment, of capital pooled in trust, of oversight and secrecy. Then came the line that hollowed Michael from the inside. A secret is a debt, and debts always come due. Michael closed the journal and stared at the wood grain of the table as if it might answer him. His father had never spoken of partners, never of hidden ventures. The man Michael had known believed in hard labor and quiet nights. This voice was someone else entirely. Duke lifted his head and patted closer, pressing his weight gently into Michael's leg. Michael rested his hand in the dog's fur without thinking, grounding himself in warmth. In the days that followed, the journal never left Michael's coat pocket. He carried it into town with him through falling snow and onto the wide marble steps of the old Duluth Public Library, a building of aged stone and leaded windows that smelled of paper and slow time. Inside, beneath lamps that softened shadows rather than erased them, Michael requested property records dating back to the late 1950s. The archivist who assisted him was a thin woman in her 40s named Laura Benton, with chestnut hair pulled into a loose knot and reading glasses perpetually sliding down the fine bridge of her nose. She spoke quietly, carefully, as if the records themselves might be offended by forceful questions. When Michael mentioned the names Watson and Cole, a subtle tension passed through her posture, as though the air had shifted. Andrew Watson had been registered in Duluth as a mechanical engineer under several federal contracts. William Cole appeared in construction and municipal bidding records. Neither name was unknown, but both were documented as background men, facilitators rather than owners. Michael spent 3 days reading yellowed filings, zoning anomalies, routing of permits that led nowhere. Beneath the dust of bureaucracy, patterns emerged that smelled faintly of buried intention. Late on the third afternoon, as twilight pressed blue against the library windows, Michael left the building with the strange sensation of being quietly followed by decades of unanswered questions. Duke waited in the truck, breath fogging the glass in steady rhythm. On the drive home, Michael said nothing. Duke seemed not to need words. The following morning brought something Michael had not prepared for. A vehicle unfamiliar to the neighborhood idled at the edge of his drive. A dull blue pickup dusted in snow rather than shining with wealth. Standing beside it was a young woman bundled against the cold in a thick forest green coat with fur lining at the hood. She was tall and slender, her posture upright despite the weight of winter layers. Dark blonde hair escaped her knit cap in loose waves around her face. Her skin was pale from cold rather than fragility, and behind wire-framed glasses her eyes were alert with uncertainty rather than fear. When she saw Michael approach, she lifted one gloved hand in tentative greeting. Her name was Emily Watson. She spoke it softly, as if already prepared for resistance. Her voice carried neither arrogance nor plead. She explained that she was a regional historical researcher with a focus on architecture and abandoned wartime infrastructure. Her grandfather, she said, had left behind boxes of records sealed by instruction not to be opened until after his death. When she finally reviewed them, she found references to Michael's address, his family name, and an old handshake agreement dated 1961. Michael listened in silence. Duke stood slightly ahead of him without command, not threatening but distinctly present. Emily's hands trembled a little when she withdrew the photograph from her coat. The paper was brittle with age. 3 young men stood in front of the house as it once looked, proud, unmarked by regret. Michael recognized his father immediately. The other 2 were strangers who suddenly were not. Before another word could be spoken, a different sound rolled up the gravel drive, the smooth, restrained approach of a luxury engine. A black sedan stopped behind Emily's truck with calculated distance. The man who stepped out wore a charcoal wool overcoat over tailored fabric, his hair dark and swept carefully from sharp cheekbones. His beard was trimmed with deliberate precision that suggested vanity rather than neglect. His gaze passed over Michael not with hostility, but assessment, the way men inspect assets rather than people. His name was Richard Cole. He spoke it as a claim. Michael felt something in the cold air close around them all like the first click of a trap. Snow still clung to the edges of the roof when Michael opened the door that morning. The light over Duluth was pale and metallic, the kind that turned breath into visible proof of being alive. Duke stood behind him, now fully upright, his broad chest steady, amber eyes alert but restrained. The blue pickup truck at the gate idled quietly, exhaust coiling into the cold air like slow breath from something patient and waiting. Emily Watson stood beside it with a folder pressed tightly against her chest, shoulders drawn inward, not from fear, but from the weight of certainty that comes with difficult truths. In daylight, she looked younger than she had the evening before, early 30s at most, tall and slender, with a posture that suggested a lifetime of leaning into responsibility rather than away from it. Her dark blonde hair was braided and tucked into her coat now, her skin pale in the winter glare, freckles faint across her nose. Her eyes held a kind of steady resolve that had likely been forged by years of unanswered questions. Inside the house, the fire was low but alive. Michael gestured her in without ceremony. Duke circled once and lay by the hearth, his body angled so that he could see both the door and the table. Emily placed her folder down beside the journal, as though the two objects had always belonged together. She moved carefully, each motion deliberate, as if afraid that careless speed might fracture the fragile order that had just begun to form between them. She spoke of Andrew Watson, not as a heroic figure but as a man whose life had been bracketed by secrets. An engineer by trade, meticulous to a fault, socially distant, emotionally exacting. His hands, she said quietly, were always marked by grease, not from labor but from endless adjustments to things that were already working. Her childhood memory of him was of silence, of filed edges and measured words, of a man who built beautiful systems but never a warm room. Michael listened without interruption. When she finished, he placed the journal on the table and opened it at a marked page. The names matched. The anxiety matched. The fear matched. The contradictions between the man he had known as his father and the voice in these pages widened into something like a fracture line through his life. They were still bent over the documents when the sound of gravel shifted outside. It was not the hesitant crunch of a neighbor's tire, nor the uneven shuffle of county trucks. It was smooth, deliberate, controlled. Duke's head lifted at once, ears angling forward without alarm, but with intent. Through the window, Michael saw the black sedan roll to a measured halt behind Emily's truck. The man who stepped out of it moved as though the landscape owed him attention. He was in his early 40s, tall and sharply structured, with dark hair parted with precise symmetry and a short beard shaped into something ornamental rather than practical. His overcoat was charcoal wool, immaculate, unsuited to the slush beneath his shoes. His eyes were pale and intent in a face that had learned how to conceal discomfort without ever forgetting it. Richard Cole introduced himself without requesting permission to speak. His voice was calm and controlled, the kind men use when they are used to being obeyed. He said his family had monitored this property for decades in silence. He said the storm had simply accelerated a timeline that already existed. He did not speak in threats. He spoke in inevitabilities. Behind him were no bodyguards, no fleet of vehicles, no violence in posture. Yet the tension in the room shifted as surely as if a weapon had been drawn. Michael refused him with equal restraint. No raised voice, no aggression. Only the firm line of a man who has learned not to bluff. Richard listened politely, eyes traveling from the journal to the ammunition crate near the fireplace, to Duke's steady, unmoving body. Then he smiled with only one side of his mouth, a concession to civility rather than humor. He said his claim would be formalized soon. That deadlines make men honest. Then he left as cleanly as he had arrived, leaving behind the silence of a room that now felt measured by threats rather than distance. Night fell hard that evening. Snow returned in thin sheets that softened light and sharpened sound. Emily remained. There was no discussion about it. The house felt less like shelter than a perimeter now, and both of them knew it. They spread the journal open again. What had once been interpreted as fear now unfolded as concealment by design. The marginal numbers began to repeat in strange, orderly sets. North, east, south, west, distances, heights. They were not meaningless after all. Michael sketched the bunker layout on a sheet of scrap paper. The space was small, rectangular, confined. Emily's mind moved faster now, the academic caution replaced by something sharper, almost mechanical. They argued quietly, their voices never rising above the sound of the wind against the windows. The numbers did not align as locations until Emily considered a reversal of reference points, a triangulation based not on outward expansion, but inward convergence. 3 measurements pointing not to 3 places, but to 1. They returned to the bunker beneath a sky heavy with snow clouds. Michael measured carefully along the west wall. Duke traced the perimeter with his nose without command, moving slowly, deliberately, a physical counterpoint to Emily's calculations. At the exact point where the lines converged, there was nothing to see. Smooth concrete. No seam. No hollow echo. Michael almost doubted the math. It was Duke who removed the last of it. The dog returned to the same spot again and again, pressing his nose against the cold surface, then pulling back and circling, as if irritated by the wall's refusal to behave as it should. Finally, he scratched once, not wildly, but with controlled insistence. The sound was sharp in the enclosed space. Michael placed his palm against the concrete above Duke's paw and felt it. A difference so slight a human hand would miss it, but not a trained dog's nose. A faint change in temperature, a whisper of hollow. Michael swung the hammer without hesitation. Concrete cracked in spiderweb fractures. Dust filled the air with bitter mineral brightness. Emily shielded her face as Michael struck again and again. Each blow was precise, disciplined. The man who had dismantled engines and doors and obstacles under fire had not forgotten how to take down a wall. The cavity opened slowly. Then the sledge broke through into darkness. Inside was a compartment lined with tar-coated boards. Resting within it was a sealed leather briefcase as old and deliberate as any military artifact. The brass fittings were green with age. The lock was intact. They carried it back into the kitchen without speaking. The house felt smaller around them, heavier. Emily's hands trembled as she undid the latch. The smell that escaped was not rot, but preservation. Old paper, oil, acetate. The documents were first. Stock holdings, land deeds, bank accounts listed in coded references that nevertheless revealed figures far too large to belong to any farmer. And every document bore the same unfamiliar name, Mateo Reyes. The tape came last. They descended once more into the bunker to play it on the old recorder. The voice that emerged was frail and broken by age, but unmistakably burdened by regret. Andrew Watson confessed. He spoke of partnership and betrayal. He named Thomas Harris not as the architect of the crime, but as the man too weak to stop it. He named William Cole as the one who pulled the trigger. Mateo Reyes had trusted them. They had buried him instead. Emily collapsed against the wall when the tape ended. Michael did not move at all. His face was carved into stillness so deep it seemed almost peaceful. Duke pressed himself against his leg as if to anchor him to the present. They surfaced into daylight with the knowledge that the past was not merely buried beneath the tree, but alive within the ground itself. Before either of them could speak, headlights flared at the end of the drive. Richard Cole had returned sooner than he promised. The night after Richard Cole's return did not pass in sleep. It throbbed in long, silent stretches, broken only by the slow ticking of the kitchen clock and the faint shifting of Duke's weight as he moved from doorway to window and back again. By dawn, the house felt as if it were holding its breath. Michael rose before the first pale light reached the frozen trees and carried the leather briefcase down the cellar steps once more. Emily followed in silence, her coat pulled tight around her frame, her breath shallow with a mix of dread and resolve. Duke descended behind them with measured caution, nose working the air as though the truth itself carried scent. The west wall no longer looked like solid stone. The jagged opening Michael had cracked into its surface the night before remained dark and accusing. Duke moved directly to it, pressing his nose along the splintered edges, inhaling deeply where old earth, dried oil, and decayed leather still lingered. He let out a low sound, not a bark, but something closer to recognition. Michael knelt and touched the inside of the cavity again, confirming what they already knew. Whatever had been hidden there had been meant to last for generations. Back in the kitchen, the briefcase sat between them like an accusation made of brass and leather. Emily's hands trembled again as she placed the documents back inside with careful order, as if the dead still required respect. Michael did not touch the papers this time. He reached only for the reel of tape. Its casing was cracked and clouded from age, the label half peeled and yellowed. He held it in his calloused palm and felt an unfamiliar kind of weight. Not metal, not wealth, but consequence. They drove into town under a sky that could not yet decide whether to clear or collapse. Snowbanks stood like barricades along the streets of Duluth, and the lake wind cut through even closed windows. The radio repair shop stood near the edge of the old commercial district, its front window crowded with dusty transceivers, copper coils, and skeletal machines frozen in outdated purpose. The man who owned it was named Harold Benson, a stooped figure with white hair sticking out in soft disarray beneath a knitted cap, his back bent by decades of leaning over circuitry. His hands shook slightly as he handled the tape machine Michael brought him, but his eyes were sharp and young the moment he saw the reel. "I can try," Harold said in a voice that trembled with both age and excitement. "But this thing hasn't been awake in a long time." He worked slowly, cleaning the heads, replacing a brittle belt with one scavenged from a drawer of forgotten parts. Emily watched every motion with strained attention. Michael stood with his hands folded behind his back, motionless as a sentry. The sound that finally emerged was weak at first, just static, then breath. Then a man's voice, cracked and thin, but unmistakably human. Harold cut the power at once and looked up at Michael with sudden gravity. "You don't want to hear this here," he said quietly. They took the tape to the Duluth Police Department that same day. Captain Daniel Miller met them outside the evidence office. He was a tall man in his mid-40s, broad-shouldered without excess weight, his uniform stretched by years of physical discipline rather than indulgence. His face was angular, clean-shaven except for a faint shadow of stubble that never quite yielded to regulation. His hair was dark and cut close, his eyes a steady gray that missed very little. There was something worn but unbroken about him, the look of someone who had buried too many friends without ever allowing grief to dull his vigilance. When Michael introduced himself as a retired Marine, something in Daniel's posture softened by a fraction. Respect recognized its own. They listened to the tape inside a narrow, soundproof room, the recorder placed at the center of a metal table scarred by years of use. Emily sat on one side, Michael on the other. Daniel stood behind them, arms crossed, eyes focused but unreadable. The voice on the tape spoke slowly, as if each word were a step downward into confession. Andrew Watson named them all. Mateo Reyes had been the mind, the builder of the fortune, the immigrant who believed in brothers. William Cole had been hunger made into flesh. He had brought the gun. He had fired it in the woods. Thomas Harris and Andrew Watson had stood there afterward, frozen by fear, paralyzed by the realization that silence was now their only way forward. They had buried Reyes and buried the truth on the same night. They had built their lives on what they stole. Watson's voice broke when he admitted he had never managed to outrun the sound of that shovel. When the tape ended, no one moved. Emily's hands were clenched into fists so tight her knuckles drained white. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, but she made no sound. Michael felt nothing at first. Not shock, not anger. Only a tightening inside his chest that refused to release. Then Daniel Miller stepped forward and turned off the recorder with deliberate care. The investigation moved faster than Michael had expected and slower than Emily wished. The forest behind the old railway spur was sealed by law enforcement within days. Forensic teams cleared snow and ice, probing the ground where the tape described. A shallow grave emerged beneath layers of frozen soil. When the remains were uncovered, what was left of a man surfaced with quiet finality. DNA tied what time could not erase. The name Mateo Reyes was written back into the world after 6 decades of silence. Richard Cole was taken into custody on a quiet afternoon when snow fell in soft, uncommitted flakes. He did not resist. He did not speak. His face held the cold stiffness of someone who had grown up knowing the truth, but learning to outrun it with money and threat. His constructions would not save him now. Neither would his surname. In the Chiatachis days that followed, the house on the edge of Duluth no longer felt like a refuge. Michael felt the silence differently now. It accused him, not for his own actions, but for the blood that had financed the walls around him. He slept little. When he did, the dreams were not of war. They were of shovels striking frozen earth beneath moonlight he could not escape. Emily remained near him through the process. She did not ask for comfort. She did not offer empty consolation. She worked beside the truth as though it were a fragile mechanism that would break if handled with emotion alone. Daniel Miller checked on them regularly, his voice steady, his presence authoritative without becoming oppressive. He did not speak as an officer alone. Sometimes he spoke as a man who understood the price of inheritance that no one chooses. One evening, after the evidence had been catalogued and the legal machinery set in motion, Michael sat alone on his porch with Duke beside him. Snow fell gently, as if the sky were trying to soften the ground that had once hidden murder. Duke pressed his massive head into Michael's thigh and sighed. The warmth of the dog's body cut through the cold that no fire could reach. Michael finally spoke aloud to the night. "I wore a uniform to protect people I never knew," he said quietly. "And all this time, I was standing on blood I never earned." Duke lifted his head and looked at him with eyes free of judgment. The dog did not understand what had been taken or stolen. He understood only that his human was in pain, and that presence was the medicine he could give. Michael reached down and curled his fingers into the thick fur at Duke's neck. For the first time since the storm, the weight of the truth did not crush him completely. It pressed. It demanded. But it did not break him. The confession had opened the grave. Now it would open the future. Winter tightened its grip on Duluth as the final truth settled into public record. DNA confirmation closed the last door of doubt. The name Mateo Reyes was no longer a rumor whispered between dusty ledgers and forgotten graves. It was now etched into the language of the law. From that moment forward, the story no longer belonged only to Michael and Emily. It reached across state lines, across generations, and finally arrived at the door of the woman who had carried the heaviest shadow of all. Sarah Reyes arrived on a gray afternoon, when the sky pressed low and heavy against the lake. She was in her late 60s, small-framed but upright, her posture shaped by decades of quiet endurance rather than fragility. Her silver-gray hair was pulled into a modest bun at the nape of her neck. Deep lines framed her eyes and mouth, not from bitterness, but from a life learned through restraint. Her skin held the warm olive undertone of her grandfather's bloodline despite the northern cold. She wore a simple dark coat, sensible boots, and no jewelry at all. When she stepped into Michael's home for the first time, she did not look around in wonder or anger. She only stood very still, as if listening to the house itself. "I grew up being told my grandfather ran away with stolen money," she said quietly. "My mother died believing it. I lived my whole life believing it." Her voice did not shake. The tremor was deeper than voice. It lived inside the bones. Michael sat across from her at the same table where betrayal had first been spoken aloud. Duke lay between them, his head resting on his paws, watching each movement with deliberate calm. Emily stood near the window, hands folded tightly before her chest. No one interrupted as Sarah spoke. Decades of shame do not release themselves quickly. The legal process moved with the measured inevitability of winter. Months passed. Financial records were sliced apart inch by investigators and forensic accountants. The Cole family's money trails unraveled like threads pulled too hard. Richard Cole became smaller in every headline. His construction empire began to collapse under the weight of investigations, frozen accounts, and civil suits. He no longer appeared in tailored overcoats. When Michael saw him next, it was in a county courthouse corridor beneath fluorescence that made every face look stripped of illusion. The arrogance that once shaped Richard's jaw had collapsed into exhaustion. The confrontation came on a night when snow fell in thick, wet sheets, and the world felt sealed behind white curtains. Richard arrived at Michael's property without warning, accompanied by a single man who stood near the truck with a stance too rigid to be accidental. The guard was young, late 20s perhaps, athletic but tense, his eyes constantly searching for threat rather than understanding it. His jacket was lightweight, unsuited for the lake wind. Fear had trained him more than discipline. Richard looked older. His face had thinned. The precise grooming of his beard had given way to irregular edges. When he spoke, the authority that once lived in his voice had fractured into desperation. "I just want to talk," he said, "without lawyers." Michael did not invite him in. He led him instead to the cellar entrance, the place where everything had ended and begun again. Emily followed cautiously. Duke remained close at Michael's side. Underground, beneath exposed lamps and raw concrete, Richard's restraint collapsed. His voice cracked under pressure that had nowhere left to retreat. "My grandfather ruined everything," he said. "And so did yours. But my family paid for it while yours lived on that land in peace." Before Michael could answer, the young guard lunged forward and seized Emily's arm in panic, as if violence were suddenly the last tool left to keep control. Michael's reaction was not rage. It was memory. His body responded before his thoughts completed themselves. The warning shot struck the earth wall inches from the guard's shoulder. Dirt exploded into the air. Duke surged forward in the same instant, teeth bared, not attacking but blocking space with the absolute clarity of a living wall. The guard froze. Richard dropped to his knees as if the sound alone had emptied him. No one was wounded, but everything had crossed the point of denial. The charges that followed included trespass, intimidation, and obstruction. Richard Cole's final illusions of control vanished beneath formal arrest. The weight of his family's sin became his own sentence. The civil judgment arrived in quiet legal language that no longer felt abstract. All assets tied to Mateo Reyes's stolen fortune were ordered returned to his legal heir through restitution and a protected trust. Sarah Reyes received the documents without triumph. She held them as one might hold the name of a returned dead. Emily and Michael signed the renunciation without hesitation. Neither sought a share. Their names vanished from the ledger of profit as deliberately as they had stepped into the ledger of truth. When the final signatures dried, Sarah looked at Michael and said, "You gave my family its name back." Her voice carried gratitude without ceremony. That was all. The land that had held blood could no longer hold Michael. He felt that truth long before he spoke it out loud. The silence he once sought had turned into an echo chamber of betrayal. Within weeks, he contacted a Northern Conservation Trust. The transaction unfolded without spectacle. He sold the property for a fraction of its true value under one condition only. The land would never be developed. It would remain wild. Wind and snow would inherit what men had poisoned. A separate portion of the settlement was directed into a scholarship fund bearing Mateo Reyes's name for first-generation immigrant students in engineering and finance. Michael did not attend the announcement ceremony. He watched it, later on, a muted television with Duke beside him. His final move was not one of escape, but of redirection. Michael rented a modest home near the Veterans Medical Center outside town. The building was plain brick, with narrow stairs and a patch of fenced yard out back. He began accompanying Duke to weekly therapy sessions, where wounded veterans learned to speak again, not through language, but through presence. Duke, now older but unshaken, learned to sit beside wheelchairs and hospital beds with the same vigilance he had once shown beneath gunfire. Michael did not grow rich from the truth. He grew quieter, lighter. The guilt that did not belong to him released its grip inch by inch. What remained was responsibility chosen rather than inherited. On a late winter morning, as sunlight finally cut low and gold across the snow, Michael sat on his small back step, with Duke pressed against his thigh. The city breathed differently here. Sirens were distant, the lake wind less cruel. Somewhere 2 blocks away, a veteran laughed for the first time since returning home. Michael rubbed Duke's aging brow and smiled faintly. "We fought another kind of war," he said softly. "And this time, we laid the weapon down at the end." Duke leaned into him with a slow, steady warmth. The past had been exhumed. Justice had walked its long, delayed road. And in the silence that followed, not empty this time but honest, a new beginning was finally allowed to exist. Sometimes the greatest miracles do not arrive with thunder or blinding light. They arrive quietly, through truth finally spoken, through a burden finally laid down, through a heart that dares to choose what is right when it would be easier to turn away. Michael never asked for riches. He asked only for peace. And when the truth shattered his world, God did not remove the pain, but he gave him the strength to carry it without becoming bitter. That is how faith often works, not by sparing us from storms, but by walking with us through them. In our own lives, we all carry hidden weights, regrets we never confessed, losses we never healed, choices that shaped us in ways we barely understand. But this story reminds us of something eternal. No lie buried deep enough can escape God's light. No wrong is beyond redemption, and no soul is ever too old to begin again. If this story touched your heart, may it remind you that your past does not define your future. Only your choices today do. If you believe that miracles still happen quietly in ordinary lives, if you believe that truth still matters, if you believe that love and loyalty between humans and animals reflect God's own compassion, then please share this story with someone who needs hope today. Leave us a comment and tell us where you are watching from. Your words may be the encouragement someone else has been praying for. And if you enjoy stories that restore faith in goodness, in loyalty, and in God's quiet power, please subscribe to the channel so we can walk this journey together. May God bless you and your family. May He guard your heart, your home, and your loved ones, and may His peace follow you long after this story ends. Amen.